Call to order the August 9th meeting of the Portsmouth Community Network Broadband Authority. Thank you all for being here today. Madam Secretary, if you would call the roll.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Barnes is absent. Mr. Battle? Mr. Glover?
Here.
Mr. Moody?
Here.
Dr. Whitaker is absent. Mr. Woodard is absent. Mrs. Lucas-Burke?
And I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up on our agenda is the adoption of minutes, and if you haven't had an opportunity to view those, they're in your packet. If you have had an opportunity to review them and there are no changes, I entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
For a second.
Second.
It has been moved and properly second. Madam Secretary, will you call our roll?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Barnes is absent. Mr. Battle?
Yes.
Mr. Glover?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Dr. Whitaker is absent. Mr. Woodard is absent. Mrs. Lucas-Burke?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we have adopted our minutes. Next up is, we're still in the hearing process. We began last month in July, and we're carrying over to this month. This is the last month for anyone to come before this group regarding our rate schedule.
I think we're going to keep it open still.
Oh, we're going to just keep it open until, okay. So it will be open until further notice, until we hear something or move to our next step in this process. So it is open, and if anyone who is listening wants to come in, it will be open for that process. Next up on our agenda is our Wi-Fi deployment update, and we'll hear from our attorney, Sweringer.
Sure. So last month we talked about expanding the public Wi-Fi access to some of those low-income housing communities. Since last month, we now sent out letters to all the owners of those properties and are waiting to hear back from them. And we're going to be reaching out to PRHA because they have some relationships with some of these owners to see if we can't get in contact with them more directly. But until then, Daniel has some follow-up items related to this expansion and what it looks like at PRHA, because I know there were some questions as to what the schematics look like and what the actual devices that have been installed look like.
Okay. Good afternoon. So we'll just kind of recap with some of the report backs from our last meeting, and that's what you all have in front of you. The first request was to just how much of our network that's in the ground is actual excess capacity. When we look at what is excess, that is available to be leased to businesses, whomever that would come in and approach the authority. There is what we refer to technically as 5 buffer tubes, and that's just a single tube, but within that tube there is 12 fibers. So we have 60 fibers or 30 pairs that is available for lease. So 60 of that 288 is strictly excess. And we still have some governmental excess built in for future whatever government buildings or whatever that we may do or relocate. There's still excess. So even with this 60, we're still not at capacity. This is excess capacity that we know we're not going to use or plan to use. The next, which is your, should be your third page, is just an example of what the Wi-Fi deployment looks like. If I'm not mistaken, this is Swanson Homes. And this shows exactly how we architected, and those individual spots show where the APs are.
The APs are essentially what
broadcast
sends out the
signal.
Wi-Fi.
Right. And the red dots on that line show the fiber connectivity going to each one of them. So that's just a sample architectural design of how we looked at each one of the PRHA properties. The second page in your packet is a sample picture. This is of, I believe, Dale, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason we chose this one and not Swanson, because some of the pictures that we got of the access points included houses. We didn't want to include that in your packet.
Right.
The picture that you see here is the actual PRHA office, so that's why we included that one rather than one of the others, just for that.
So the little piece that hangs down.
Yeah,
is
it looks
the
like a
device?
paint can,
Yeah.
what we refer to it. That is the actual access point that is broadcasting the signal out.
Okay.
And that actually goes in a 360 degree, so it just broadcasts it out.
So,
Yes.
so when you were speaking earlier about having to access private property,
Yes.
are you, of course, you're talking about this type of equipment as well as some wiring, underground wiring?
Underground. So with the private, what we would do with the private would be something very similar. We would look at the architectural and the red line. We would have to go underground, come up closest to wherever we're going to attach that access point, and then go right up the side of the building, attach the access point, and then that's what it would then broadcast the signal.
Okay. And I'm just curious again, as far as light poles and why aren't those being used versus private homes for putting access points on such as this?
We use both.
You are? Okay.
Yes, that was just one example that I came to that was, we didn't, like I said, we didn't want to include homes. The ones around Swanson were mostly those light poles that were in the middle. But the ones that had the more, I'll say, condo buildings, there's not really light poles in the middle. So we actually attached to, in a similar manner as PRHA attached their equipment. We ran conduit up the side, blended it in, and attached it right to the side.
So I'm just curious, so what makes you determine whether you attach it to like a private building versus a public light pole, which I would assume all of the areas have public light poles in them?
Well, the light poles throughout the city, when you step out of downtown, then you step into Dominion. And those are not our light poles.
Okay.
Those are Dominion. So that would be a separate agreement between the authority and
Okay,
Dominion to be
okay.
able to attach to that.
Okay.
But one of the big factors that we look at, if you see the green and the yellow design, that's the strength of the signal. And as we move the access point at various locations, we look for strength of signal. And then we'll visually, so what is the closest that we can attach an access point to that gives us that same strength?
Okay.
We're not necessarily looking for specifically for a light pole or a building. We're looking for the metrics of the signal strength.
Okay.
Good.
And then the last one is the estimated population. And we've also updated this map to include that you see the various citizens. Now, please keep in mind that this data is from the 20, and I notated that at the bottom, it's from the 2020 American Community Survey as well as the census block data. This is not accurate. It was when it was taken, but we are beyond that. But this gives you a ballpark or a frame of reference of the number of citizens that would be anticipated if we deployed Wi-Fi for all of these campuses that we're referring to. So we're talking about 6,500, 7,000 potential citizens. And you can see the breakdown of what we estimated from the census block data as well as the community survey of those campuses that have the higher population versus those that, may not have next to nothing population.
And as a result of, also to coincide with the Wi-Fi deployment, the letters for all of these properties went out as well. Yeah, so those were authorized, and we're reaching out. So once we start to hear back from people, then we can begin to build out.
Right, then we can get the quotes and figure that out.
Right. Okay. All right. Next up on our agenda is our new business, and the first topic is the our business and the business topics. Are there any?
Yes, the kind of discussion about moving forward with an RFP and what that might look like. So,
I skipped all over that. Yes.
Discussion RFP.
Potential RFP.
right.
Yes. Mhm.
So we touched on this a little bit before, but the timing makes sense to be talking about this in earnest now.
Right.
So as we had discussed a little bit before, we have this extra space that Daniel was referring to, the strands. And We've set up everything with the dark fiber lease, so that's available, but that's just a very small component of how most municipal fiber rings work. Most of them use RFPs to try to attract the most economic development and the most potential partners, essentially. So now that the regional ring is actually under construction, it's a great time to put out an RFP because potential respondents can see that that regional ring is actually happening. And the other advantage of the RFP over a traditional dark fiber lease is it's kind of akin to the EDA selling property versus the city. So when the EDA sells property, it gets to create development agreements, it gets to have a say in the use. And by doing this as an RFP, you can include in your RFP what you're looking for, what your goals are, and have entities report back to you with what their idea is, and you can vet if that idea makes sense for Portsmouth. So, and there's not really much cost involved in putting out an RFP. If you don't like what comes back, we don't have to accept anything. And the RFP can be phrased very broadly, that in a way that would allow, if you liked multiple ideas and you have enough space, you could accept multiple plans as well. So our general suggestions and kind of next steps for going the RFP route would be that we'd have a very broad RFP that says something like, we have 60 strands available, what are your plans for it, and how are you going to compensate us for access to these strands? And then in addition to that, we can include all the background information. So we can show what our ring looks like, all the laterals. We can show our dark fiber rate schedule so they know what value in general we're placing on those strands. And so if they want to deviate from that value, they need to show why they think that that's justified. We can list some of the projects like this Wi-Fi deployment and like the PRHA Wi-Fi as well. Perhaps somebody will want to propose a program where they take over the providing that free Wi-Fi as part of their proposal. I don't know. And then we can also include your goals. So goals could be things like better affordability for consumers, trying to attract new businesses that have large technology needs or new internet service providers, marketing for the ring as well, and operations, and return on investment as well. You can have all these things included in your RFP. And ultimately, like I said, this is how most successful municipal fiber rings are run, is using this RFP process to try to bring in potential either contractors or partners, however it's structured. So the next step for this would be you talk to the consultants that the city has, Magellan, and our consultant with that, he was the CIO, is that
Yes.
right? CIO of a municipality in Florida who's done this process before. And so he can be here and we can have a brainstorming session, essentially, as to what you want to have in that RFP, what goals you want to achieve, and maybe things we can include in the RFP to make sure that we're more likely to get responses that achieve those goals. So staff is proposing that after this session, we can send you some examples of what RFPs have looked like in other localities. And in between this meeting and the next meeting, we can come up with a very broad draft RFP that we can kind of use as a template in the next session when we're talking to the consultant. To again, get that process started.
So this would be the approach to marketing the dark fiber through RFP. Is that what you?
That could be, yes, that could be part of this RFP. So you'd still have this dark fiber option. It'd be kind of operating on simultaneous tracks. So there's nothing stopping us from, if a company comes and says, hey, I don't really want to wait on this RFP, I just want to lease 10 strands of dark fiber.
Right.
We can go ahead, get that all approved, and have that going while we're still working on the RFP.
Right. So I guess my question is it a multi-pronged marketing approach other than just doing it through RFP? Are we marketing it using other venues?
The dark fiber specifically?
Right.
I would suggest that we'd have that as part of the RFP as well. If,
Yeah.
Right, include
Right.
that
Because
you're
they're gonna
looking
do
for,
it.
if somebody wants to come in and be that marketing agent for it, that they can incorporate that in a response as well.
I guess I might be misunderstanding the RFP.
I think you're referring to, are we marketing now as well as including it? Am I
Right,
correct?
Right.
Yes, which right now it's being marketed, economic development. When they see those interests, they're making sure that that's on the forefront with those businesses coming into the city. But as well, on the same note, we would want that as part of the RFP, because the main goal of the RFP is to bring multiple different facets in to cover the dark fiber, whether you're just going to lease it, whether you're going to market it, you want to operate it, you want to lease from it, whatever it is. We've got 60 strands. Tell us what you're proposing to do with it, and what kind of financial terms would be associated with that.
Right. Okay.
And so, and just to piggyback off of that, in developing the RFP, we're going to rely on the board to give the parameters of the goals, which could be marketing multifaceted. It could be looking at ISPs.
Correct.
We want it to be as broad as possible, so we have a lot of options since it's still very early in the process. So, hope that clarifies.
Mr. Battle?
Did we ever schedule a consultant to come in
The consultant's coming in next month to talk to us.
this month?
September.
Well, don't you think we need to wait until,
Right, we don't have the
with
RFP.
all this stuff, till he comes in and we ask the questions we need to ask?
Right, that's what he's coming in for. This is just, he's going to come in so we can have a brainstorming session and he can explain.
Right, so there's good time to do this and good time to do that. We need to wait until he comes and answer the questions that we would have.
Right, and he'll be here next month for that.
So is this process, does it have any kind of starting financial, cost? Or do you just let the bidders come up with where they want to?
Right.
Okay, so we don't give them any idea on,
Well, the idea that we have is we have that proposed preliminary rate schedule for the dark fiber.
Right.
But you could get respondents who want to do some sort of profit share or who have different payment options that they might want to propose.
So back to this, as far as the access points in the communities that's been identified, an RFP has already been put out on this?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
So that's what, next month, we
The
will
consultant.
have a kind of base draft, very
Okay.
broad RFP, and then we'll have the consultant here so we can hash out whether the board wants to make changes to that, what you are looking for in this RFP.
Okay.
all right. Any other questions, concerns? Okay. Other business topics that we have,
So we have some follow-up items then. So because of this RFP process, that changes a little bit the agreement that's going to be between the city and the authority. So that agreement, send out a draft late this week, early next week. And then we can also discuss that at the next meeting. That will need to be approved on both sides. So both this authority and the city will need to approve that agreement because it's an agreement saying that the city is giving this authority use and access up to probably that 60 strands.
Right.
And the Wi-Fi equipment at PRHA so that they can go ahead and do this. Also, staff is this week having a meeting and discussing the budget, and next meeting we will have a budget to present that the board will need to adopt so we can get things like insurance and have that all taken care of before you actually take possession over any of this fiber infrastructure
Right.
or send out the RFP.
And the budget, remind us again which pot of money this comes from, general fund?
That's a
That's a
Mimi
Mimi
question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Mimi.
Of the budget?
Yes. What, I think the question is,
funding.
the question is funding for this, like where from the city's budget will appropriation come?
Right.
So we would have to do a transfer, but we just have to identify the funding source. But it would probably just be a
Oh,
transfer.
To the table.
Okay. So they don't know
So
who's
we can
talking.
get- Sorry.
So it looks like it would just be a transfer from probably the fund balance
Okay.
to cover that cost. And council would just have to we'll present it in an ordinance and ask for the appropriation to be approved.
From the general fund?
From general fund?
Yes.
Oh, fund balance.
Fund balance.
Fund balance. Okay.
And then.
And the agreement between the city and this authority, the city is the council? Or,
You're right, the council will need to approve that. So
Okay.
this board needs to approve it, and then after that, council will need to approve it.
right, which brings up the next point about the reformation of the authority. And, there has been some conversation about some board members wanting to put other people to serve in their stead. And I guess we as an authority need to determine how far we want to take this process before we begin to allow citizens to be appointed to this board to take it to the next level. And me and Vice Chair met with Attorney Swearinger and Mr. Jones and City Manager Chapman and Attorney Graham Williams. And we want to see at least the RFP process to be implemented, and then the budget, of course, to be in place. And the agreement is the sticky thing, because the board, the authority is telling the council that we need your approval, and that's where it get hairy. So if there's any discussion from the authority members on this, we'll hear those now as well. Yes.
Well, I had stated from the outset that this board needs to consist of, just like any other appointed board that we have, and we need to give them the authority to transact the business of the authority. That board needs to consist of professionals that are specific to this discipline, so that they bring their information, their resources, their contacts, all of the things that they can do to help provide us, the city, as any other appointed board does, with that expertise so that we can make the best decision. Ultimately, the decision is going to rest with council how we proceed. Just like any other board that we have. I mean, they can make decisions, but in terms of how we proceed, it goes back to the council. I don't feel, and I've never felt comfortable with having participation on this board because I don't know enough about what we're doing. And by not knowing enough and not having subject matter experts, we hold up the process because we have to go from the beginning. Like a lot of this stuff that we've discussed in my mind, fiber, how it works, how do you deploy it, what's the pros and cons. I mean, I appreciate the information that's been provided, but under no circumstances am I anywhere prepared to make the decisions. And I just don't feel comfortable doing it. I think we should have subject matter experts in the areas of technology, internet, providing all those things. And that way we get a mix of the best people to make the best decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Glover. Mr. Battle?
Well, that's a good theory. The most important thing that we need on any board is integrity and folk with the ability to just make good choices with the information that's put before them. This is a board that I have no problems being on. I do have some background, but even if I didn't have background, the most important thing that we can bring to these boards is not the degree of professionalism, but the degree of integrity and who are you going to serve. So,
Thank you, Mr. Battle. Mr. Moody.
I'm with the mayor, and a good example of that is the SIPSA board. When it was staffed by council members, it historically operated in the red and struggled with that until it was decided that they would seek people with expertise. And once that occurred, there was a dramatic turnaround where they erased the debt over time, and that now it's a board that operates in the black and is doing what it was purposed to do, and that's to serve the people in an efficient manner. I couldn't agree more. And there are people with expertise that have a lot of integrity also. So I don't think we would have a problem staffing it. But I think that model works best and serves our citizens best. People with expertise with council liaisons.
Dr. Whitaker.
I think it depends. It depends on what the goal and objective is of the organization. I think that the point about having experts, we have several boards where you just have citizens who just bring their everyday experiences. I do know that when we start talking about certain persons and communities with experts serving on these boards, that we tend to start just duplicating what we've seen before. I don't think that the information is being presented. We have our technology person that's here that's giving us information. We get legal advice. Personally, I don't see it as anything that is too cumbersome. I do know that there are viewpoints that will come up that you're probably not going to get. I mean, this wasn't anything that you all brought to us. We brought this to you, this concept of making Wi-Fi free throughout the community. That wasn't something that was originally brought to us, unless I'm mistaken. But I don't remember that being part of our original discussion. I think when we started talking amongst ourselves, it came up that we would like, if we're going to put $10 million into a network, we said we think our citizens should get a benefit. I believe that's how it came up. And that didn't come from any subject matter experts. That came from a perspective that was here. And so I think that it depends on what it is that's trying to be achieved. I know these type of boards usually have a lot of access to information, significant contracts that are going to be utilized, and so I don't have an issue with continuing to serve in this capacity as council persons. So that's my point.
Mr. Battle.
we have to kind of get away from thinking that certain models will fit everywhere. And it's easy to say that SIPSA started in the black and the council was on the board, and then, in the red, and then once SIPSA took over, everything's in the black. And that's a wonderful statement, and it's easy to say. And these are the things that we be dealing with, but we don't get into the nuts and bolts, such as, have we pulled bonds for SIPSA? what stake did we put in their success? So what I'm saying is, we always say things when we're debating to make it appear goalish, but we never go into the nuts and bolts of how it happened and what part the city played. As sweet as we want to make SIMSA, the city played an instrumental part in turning it around and the success. So we need to investigate these statements of grandeur and go down to the nuts and bolts and see, don't just tell me, yeah, it did real well but there's reasons why. And the reason why they did real well because the city was in their back or supporting them in the effort. And the city put a lot in the game, so.
Thank you, Mr. Battle. So we're at a point where we're already in the mix of processes, and it's, the advice from our attorney was that, members can resign, and we would have to go through a process to appoint citizens to that board. So even if we began the process and went through the personnel committee to bring them on, it would still be a couple months.
Yeah, but let's just be clear. I don't think you were suggesting one way or the other who serves on the board. You were just advising on if we were to put others on the board, what that process would be.
That's correct.
Right. So I don't want it to appear that she was advising as far as putting citizens up here. No, it's just that's the legal advice on how that process would
Right.
be.
Well, let me ask the legal question then. Can a member of the board resign under our current configuration?
Yes.
And if that member of the board does want to resign, what happens to that member's seat? Can they recommend a person? Is it an appointment process? How does that work?
It's the normal appointment process that council goes through, so I believe
Okay.
that's to the personnel committee.
Okay, and that's good to know.
So that's where we are. That's the conversation. We've had robust dialogue about it, and, this is where we move, Mr. Battle.
If there are folk that don't want to serve on the board, that's democracy. There's nothing wrong with that. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
it's not a big issue. You don't want to serve, you don't want to serve.
And I would think at what point we have members to resign and we get to the part where we begin to appoint citizens to the board, we would probably need to revisit our agreement that we originally set up for it to be a council. Then some of those provisions would probably change.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I'm trying to write it so that you wouldn't have to do that.
Okay.
So we need at our next meeting, we need to revisit our bylaws
The bylaws.
Well, what specifically about the
as
bylaws?
far as what we're discussing now, as far as members serving, council members serving, resigning, just to go over that, just to make sure all of us are clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're adding bylaws review at our next meeting for September 13th.
And can you send a copy out to us this week? So we have.
Okay. Were there any other business topics that need to be discussed today? All right. right, hearing none. We do have public speakers is on our agenda, and we did have one citizen to request to speak. Ms. Donna Sy, are you? You can stand over by Ms. Step.
I was gonna get the podium.
Oh, she's gonna pull the podium up, so we're gonna bring the podium up. You have the floor, and you have 3 minutes.
Good evening. My name is Donna Sy, and I had some ideas when I was driving here, so I hadn't planned. But tonight, there's going to be talking about Arpa funding, and it said in the information is to perform broadband projects for underserved households and businesses. And I was doing a little calculations on how much ARPA funds, and that don't mean I'm right, but I was doing my little calculation, and there was over $12 million from looking at the budget book for the year 2023 with all the ARPA fund spending. So how is this team going to work with the civic leagues throughout the city to determine the needs? I mean, I see y'all got all of this, but I'm really interested in how the city folks are working with the people in the city versus picking and choosing whomever y'all want. So that is just an idea that came to my mind. How are you getting out in the community and talking with the civic league folks in the different districts? So that's just my interest. I know you got some, but how do you get the whole city involved? Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Sy. And one of the reason why we bought the broadband online in the first place was to be able to offer Wi-Fi, internet access, fiber options to communities that didn't have this availability, and to offer it affordably or close to free was the intent for this board. There was an article in the paper last week that talked about Loomis is going to be now offering fiber option access to areas without Wi-Fi and internet services as well, and those service areas don't seem to coincide with what we're going to be offering, and we thought our public housing communities would be a good way to offer free and affordable services. So if Mr. Jones or Attorney Swanger, if you have any additional comments to add on to that, then.
Just that we had the connectivity study done several years ago, and that was a big basis for also where to locate these.
Right. Okay. Are there any other comments or no other speakers? Then this meeting is adjourned, and we will have our next meeting on September 13th.